All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City the Immaculata back with you. Hopping on a little bit early today for the sake of doing my civic duty, finishing this up fairly quickly and succinctly and early this morning so that I can go watch the inauguration speech like many other Americans will be doing. And I thought it would be, let's see, it would be pertinent today to discuss some of the American government versus the Catholic Church with a talk broadly about the Indian boarding schools. And I'm doing something a little bit different here today. I probably just glitched because I saw the little internet bars thing drop a little bit. But what I'm going to be doing here today is a little bit different. What I would like to do is, well, historically, what I've done on this channel is with these lives, is I'll come up with a series of notes that I will use to prompt my memory as I'm kind of going through these things. And I didn't really do that for this particular live for the reason, not for being lazy, but for the reason of the fact that I'm in the process of writing a book on Lakota Catholicism, a long exposition on the subject. And I wanted to challenge myself a little bit today by seeing how well I know this information and how well I can articulate it kind of off the cuff. I do have a sketch of some of my notes to the side here of what I've been researching for this particular part of the book, but I don't have anything like what I usually have. So it's going to be a little bit different. If I fail, if I fall, if I get mud on my face, you guys will just have to bear with me and tune in next time. But it's a very challenging subject, so I'm challenging myself a little bit. I might even be challenging you in the audience a little bit with this subject. I know if you're aware of anything about it, you may actually be quite invested in it in terms of its political ramifications and things like that. But we're going to try to take an in-depth approach to it. And if nothing else, I hope you could walk away from this particular discussion with a greater insights to the full scope of what we're talking about when we talk about the boarding schools. So the first thing I want to cover before we even get to the schools is, as I'm like researching for this subject with the Lakota, the Lakota tribe is a subset of the Greater Sioux people, also known as the Oceti-Sakowin, which roughly translates to the Seven Council Fires. This is the people of the Dakota, and by Dakota, I mean the dialect Dakota, not necessarily the state. The dialect of Dakota and Lakota. There's some arguments about whether there's a mediating dialect in between them that some people refer to as Nakota, but whether that actually exists or not, there's quite a bit of debate over. At the very least, there's two different distinct dialects, and together these tribes formally make up what we would call the Sioux people, as a popular term for them. So yeah, I'm researching this particular book, and when I'm putting the stuff together, I haven't really done history at this level before of intensity of writing about it. And as I'm putting it all together, I want to make sure I'm doing a really thorough job of making the different sides accessible to the readers who are going to be reading this. And it's a daunting task, to say the least, to make sense of these, because what you're dealing with is a series of very disparate groups of people that are interacting with one another. And just to give you an idea of it, this is going to be just a section in the book, but it'll sort of introduce you to this particular topic because it affects every single thing about relationships when it comes to Native Americans. So the complexities of the interactions is kind of what I'm calling this particular area of the book. And just to kind of wrap your mind around it, when you're dealing with like the Native American people, as many of you are aware, you're not just dealing with a people, you're dealing with various tribes of people who are in any degree related or unrelated to one another. And so you have, well, first, within the tribe, you have intra-tribal dynamics, and those aren't the same necessarily from tribe to tribe to tribe, though there is much overlap at times. Then you have intertribal dynamics, which at times can be quite contentious, and even to this day, often quite contentious between the various tribes. For example, the Lakota are still to this day, if you go to like the Pine Ridge Reservation and you ask your average Oglala what they think of the Crow, they're probably going to have some choice words for the Crow. So some of that blood is still quite bad between these people. Then you have the dynamic of not just the intertribal relations, but the introduction of European people. And you don't just have the introduction of European people, you also have the introduction of the different countries of Europe that are coming over here. So first, when it comes to the people of the north in the plains regions, their first introduction would have been to the French. So they're meeting the French. Then they're meeting the British, and then eventually they're meeting what becomes the United States government and the United States people. And you have those, and those aren't all the same, right? Like let's just say the relation between, for example, the French and the Lakota is much different than the relation between the Lakota and the U.S. government would later become. And in fact, in some ways, the relations between the French government, the French contingents of people that are here, who generally speaking represent the French government, are on much more friendly terms with, say, the Lakota than the Cheyenne. Well, no, the Cheyenne become good partners of the Lakota than like maybe the Arapaho would be, or the Omaha, for example, right? Like these intertribal tensions at times are much greater than even any tension that may exist between the Indian tribe and the European people that are over here. So you've got that factor in. Then you have to factor in as I said, the U.S. government and those interactions and the sort of complex nature that those takes on, because with the U.S. government, and here we are, January 20th. Today's a prime example of that. There's a continual handing over of power, right? So it's very difficult to say when you're dealing with the U.S. government that this is the U.S. government policy in any kind of like abstract long-term way. Now, there was this general sense of what becomes known as manifest destiny, and that is going to have long-term, impacts for at least the 19th century leading on up into the 20th century. But even within that, though, there's a culture of dissimilarity between, say, when the tribes are basically subdued and placed on reservations, the government representative and agency in one tribe on one reservation is not necessarily representative of how the tribe's agents may be on another tribe over. And then when the tribes end up on reservations, how they handle living on these reservations becomes much different from one tribe to the next, right? So you have that. What's another complexity? You have the introduction of what become known as mixed bloods. This is the introduction of mixed race people, both by the standards of the U.S. government and eventually by the standards of the tribes themselves. Though earlier on, the tribes had a much different understanding of familial relationships. Over time, due to the pressures of the U.S. government and tribal enrollment and things like that, it becomes the tribes end up kind of conforming to these blood standards. But with the mixed bloods, there's always a dynamic that you read about within the tribal culture, as the pure Indian blood on the reservation versus these mixed bloods, which typically means mixed with white European ancestry, versus the white people. And the mixed bloods kind of find themselves in this weird dynamic where they're not quite one and they're not quite the other, and they're neither accepted by one completely from one side or the other. And eventually you see kind of a shift in many of the reservations between pure blood majority and mixed blood majorities. A lot of the times when you go to these reservations today, you'll see like clearly mixed blood ancestry among some of these, but there's still, even to this day, disputes about the authenticity of the blood of certain people, certain, you know, depending on what the situation may be, certain, what is it, purity spirals can arise in some places. So you have that. And even you can break this all the way down to the level of like with the agencies, individual agents and their representatives are much different at times. I may be on this tribe, this reservation here, and Agent Bob comes in and he's an agent and he promises me if I do these things, the US government will in return do these things for me. But then Agent Bob gets reassigned somewhere else, or he moves up the ladder, and then Agent Fred comes in, and Agent Fred's got a totally different way of viewing the reservation system and basically undermines all the stuff that Agent Bob, that we agreed to, that the government, US government, still holds the tribes to, but that Agent Fred, the perks that we were supposed to get, Agent Fred doesn't agree with those perks, so we never actually end up getting them. So there's that factor. So that just kind of gives you an idea. And in none of that have I mentioned the church and the dynamics of that yet too, because within the church, well, let me back up. Within Christianity, you have competing roles of the Protestant versus Catholic churches within the tribes. Now, there was a time when the U.S. government, as the Ulysses S. Grant administration, was attempting to assimilate these Plains tribes that had just been subdued onto the reservations. One of the policies of the U.S. government, which we're going to get into here in a minute, was to Christianize the tribes. And it was pretty much, if you got your, I'm making a, some oversimplification here, but if you kind of got your paperwork signed quick enough and into the grant, the people that are in charge of the Indian Bureau, Mr. Episcopalian over here could be the one to go missionize to this part of the reservation in South Dakota. And the Catholic Church is trying to represent their own interests and get into some of these various places. Now, an interesting thing about the boarding school situation, moving over to that, part of the policy around this, originating from the grant policy, is this idea, and it's sort of a paradigmatic setup that the Americans were kind of working under at the time. And this goes back to certain ideas of social development that were really prevalent at the time, coming out of Darwinism and coming out of social Darwinism and coming out of Marxism, and all of these things which were trickling down into society, even into the non-Marxist government like the United States government of the 19th century, but still some of these ideas still percolate. And so the idea was that there are developmental stages to a society. And just like Marx would say about going from feudal to capitalist to socialist to communist, these societies as a whole would maybe move from like the more savage societies all the way up to like the highest industrial economic powerhouses of Europe. And that there's a scientific progression that one can push a society through to reach those higher points. And that was basically what the paradigmatic policy of the Grant administration and the federal government moving forward for some years sort of revolved around, was this idea of social development. And one of the theories within this idea of social development was that you had to basically use Christianity as a tool, a pacifying tool, to kind of suppress some of those more savage elements of like a war tribe, for example, to get that sort of warrior nature out of their purview and make them focus more on things like farming and solving feuds more amicably. So you move in these Christian missionaries, you Christianize the people, and the long-term effect of that is that it helps the development. Now, keep in mind, this is a secular government. The grant policy never really cared so much about whether it was a Protestant doing this or a Catholic doing it. The secular government of the United States, remember the complexity of all these interactions, is it doesn't really matter so long as the end result is what we want it to be. We don't care which group it is so much. Now, to add to the complexity of that, within the Grant administration, there were certain, let's say, what's the word I'm looking for? There were certain purists or maybe radicals, or like if this person in the Grand Administration that has some influence in the Indian Bureau, quite a few of those agents were like hardcore Protestants, Presbyterians, Episcopalians who were not friendly to the Catholic Church. They weren't even necessarily friendly to each other. And there was pressure at times placed on the Grand Administration to suppress the influence of the Catholic Church within the various tribes that we're going to be discussing. So, trying to keep up with where I'm at in all of this in my mind here, right? So you have all of these groups that are vying to be able to get in. Now, what I'm studying right here is predominantly to do with the United States of America. Keep in mind, I should have mentioned this, this is part of the complexity of the interactions. You're not just dealing with the United States of America. There was a very similar campaign and policy that was taken up by the Canadian government. This policy that would eventually lead to the boarding schools being adopted as a way basically of the Canadian government. See, this was not a localized idea of the time that societies develop. The Canadian government were just as influenced by these ideas as those in the American government were. So the whole concept being that, you put these people on a reservation, you Christianize them, and then in particular, you get their children and put them in a boarding school that is operated by these Christians. And so that way you're less dealing with the stubbornness of the adults, and you've got a more malleable population of the children. So that's the sort of and that's common, it seems, between Canada and the United States. Though I will say right from the top, I'm not an expert in what's happened in Canada, especially recently. We're going to discuss that a little bit, but most of my interest has been within the Lakota tribe specifically. And like I said, what happened in the Lakota tribe of Pine Ridge, of Rosebud, is not necessarily the same as what you're going to find in different tribes in South Dakota, let alone the rest of the United States, let alone Canada. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But there's some broad things that we can discuss about, but you just have to keep it, in your mind that if you're watching this from Canada, for example, what's happened to you guys, there's going to be some differences. There's overlap and differences to what's the story's all about. Okay, so part of the policy is to open these boarding schools. And now the boarding schools, there's quite a bit of interesting things happening within the boarding schools. And give me a second, guys. I just want to scroll down to my notes specifically about the boarding schools. Well, I kind of have to begin with reservation life, right? I'm going to go with the Lakota here because it's a pretty extreme example of what happens, but all the tribes were in some ways affected by subjugation to the reservations. Now, the Plains Indians, in particular the Lakota, right before all of this happens, these are kind of, when you think in your imagination of like what the pre-subdued Indian tribes are like, usually people are thinking about the Lakota, the Sioux, on horseback, hunting buffalo on the open prairie, living in teepees, kind of nomadic, following the buffalo, a pretty free and open life in society, kind of romantic in some ways. It had many drawbacks, right? Like you wouldn't want a toothache out there. But to go from that and then to keep in mind the Lakota, the like quote unquote, we're kind of using the term empire today for what the Lakota had, because up until the point that they were defeated by the U.S. government, the Lakota territory was just massive, right? It covered Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Montana, Nebraska. Like they subdued every tribe around them. So they're they're probably the most powerful Native American tribe ever to exist. So to go from that, right, to go from the lords of the land to basically being relegated to South Dakota. And then there's a thing called the allotment policy, where you didn't necessarily want like Oglala and the Unkpapa and the Singagus all being friends with each other. So they did this thing allotment where they basically separated. There's no like, the reservations aren't continuous from one Teospaye to the next, is what these clusters of teepees are called. So you've got like the Pine Ridge, in the south, and then you have to leave the reservations, enter U.S. territory to get to the next reservation over. So the allotment kind of fractured all of this, like living for these people. And they're clustered on this land. The buffalo's gone. They're no longer hunting buffalo. The warrior culture is gone basically overnight, and they become pretty much wards of the government, subject to whatever. And again, remember, the U.S. government is coming in, and like I said, you may have Agent Bob who comes in and promises, hey, look, you guys hand over your guns, you give up this lifestyle, and we're going to educate your children, we're going to get them good jobs, we're going to bring in farming equipment, we're going to do this, that, and the other, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And so the Indians are like, okay, fair enough, deal. We agree to that. You put us on these lands, and then Agent Fred comes in, and things get mixed up. But we'll get, I'm kind of bouncing around here with some of that. So immediately there is ramifications for this change in lifestyle, and this would go too far afield. But one of the things I'm going to have to get into in this book is the effect of the reservation life on Indians, because when you look at statistics in America, usually the way that they're broken down, say like the number of alcoholics based on race or heart disease, usually it's like white, black, Latino, Asian, and they're all kind of comparable to one another. There's certainly discrepancies there, but then there's always this like Native American, right? And pay attention to that if you ever see these statistics in the future. The Native Americans ones are always disproportionately represented in terms of just like really awful like things that have happened within life on the reservation. For example, the alcoholism and drug addiction rates are just kind of comparable to the rest of races in the United States. It's absolutely through the roof, and it's a trying to like get to the core of some of these like social things that have happened. It can be quite complex, the interactions of some of that stuff. Like, for example, I know on the Oglalas in South Dakota recently, for their reservation, passed a law. This was maybe not recently. This was at some time or another. They passed a law where you had to no liquor stores and no alcohol could be sold within the reservation, in an attempt to sort of curtail the addiction problem. And then immediately what they did, these people that don't live on the tribes, that are just profiting off of the misery of these people, moved it to this little town in Nebraska that's right across the border of South Dakota, and it's basically become like the liquor town where all of the drunks have to go that are on the tribe, that live on the reservation, that they come down, and so they're still being bombarded with alcohol within, because of this little town where they set up shop at. So there's still controversies around that stuff. Lots of reasons why this stuff happened, but in the meantime, one of the things that they did, let me scroll on down, was they set up these boarding schools. And the boarding schools, intentions are mixed. It's part of the complexity of the interactions with this stuff. There's not a single reason why. If you wanted to make a single reason why the boarding schools were opened because the U.S. government wanted to propel assimilation, and this was part of the policy. But the individual intentions of the people that are opening individual boarding schools differ from school to school, from tribe to tribe. So the ones that I'm studying here on the Lakota tribe, it's the Jesuits. There's the bishop of South Dakota at the time was a man named Bishop Martin, and he was much beloved by the Native Americans in this area, much beloved by the Lakota and the Dakota and the ones that he represent, the various tribes that he represented in his diocese, because he really did have their best intentions at heart. And then you have the Jesuits, who are affectionately referred to as the Black Robes by the Native Americans, who sort of come in and work to improve to the best of their ability the life of some of these people through their various like missionary efforts and their various charities and things like that they're trying to do. And so the Jesuits gain a reputation as far as popularity goes, like, for example, Chief Red Cloud was in Oglala, and the Grant administration, when these things were being processed, had assigned an Episcopal church, because that's the other thing. The Grant policy didn't want various denominations like fighting with each other on the reservation, so you were only allowed one group per reservation. So he assigned them, the Episcopals. Red Cloud with the delegation of Lakota and came all the way from the plains all the way to DC to demand that they wanted the black robes. They wanted the Jesuits on their tribe. So the Jesuits had this reputation of being, by today's standards, there's certainly some sternness that's involved, but that's generally a indicator of how education was at that time. Now, my great grandfather was an educator who would have been teaching in the teens, in the 20s, in the 30s, and 40s, and I know at least through the teens and the 20s, probably into the 30s as well, he would walk around with a paddle. And my grandfather and my great uncle used to tell me that was more for show than anything, but still there was a disciplinary element to the schools at those times. So when you hear about like that sort of disciplinarian side of the Jesuits, they weren't necessarily, it's not like they changed their tactics in the dealings with the Indian kids. Now, granted, the way that the Lakota in particular raised their children was very much, and you read the nuns say this, right, that the parents, it's spare the rod, spoil the child. There was not a lot of disciplinarian acts that these Indian children would undergo through their own parents. So to go from that to the sort of regimental standards of a European style education probably was pretty extreme for some of these kids. Now, when they would go to these schools, and this is where the controversy kind of really begins, because initially Agent who did I say was, yeah, Agent Bob is the good agent. Agent Bob comes in, he says, look, we're gonna build these schools on the reservation, government money. We're gonna have the Christian missionaries come in and operate them. You, in this case, the Oglala, want the black robes to have that job. Here they are. We're giving you the Jesuits to operate these schools. And then we're going to educate your children so that the children can therefore assimilate to the white culture that is coming. But then you have some other people that are within the government that, one, don't believe that this kind of assimilation thing is going to happen, because there's some optimism that takes place when all of this stuff is kickstarted with the Grant administration, that this is going to be a fairly quick process. Basically, one generation of kids, maybe two generations of kids, and you're basically going to have these Indians that are all but white in their attitudes and the way that they live. And then you have these other people that are part of the government, and they're like, a group of them don't think it's possible at all for the Indians to advance or develop, as it were. They think that they're savages and that's all they'll ever be. More predominant, though, is a group that just thinks it's going to take a lot longer and that the way that they're going about it is not effective. So there's constantly like undermining of the quote unquote policy of the U.S. government. And then when the administrations change, right, you have changes when Grant leaves, and then you have Garfield, and then you have, Cleveland, and then you have McKinley, and then you have Teddy Roosevelt. Like, there's changes from each administration to the next on how they handle the quote unquote Indian problem, as they called it. So then specifically, like, for example, with Rosebud, with what becomes the St. Francis mission, and then what becomes Pine Ridge. The Pine Ridge is the St. Francis mission, and Rosebud is the Holy Rosary mission. These two boarding schools become the principal boarding schools for the Lakota people, and they're kind of isolated. They're out in the middle of South Dakota. If you've ever been to South Dakota, there's not a lot in between. And the first challenge of what happens with these boarding schools is that it breaks up the family and the communal structures, which was a devastating effect on the Indians that I don't think that they were quite prepared for. You would hear these stories, and it's kind of heart-wrenching, from the nuns. When they come to drop the kids off, they're not quite for sure what they're supposed to do. So the parents are not quite for sure. So they drop the kids off, but then they're just like they're like desperately missing their kids. So there's these stories of just parents in their teepees out in front of Pine Ridge, right? Just like camped out there because they want to be able to see their kids. Because again, it's the other thing you got to realize with these kind of tribal societies that were very much nomadic, the family unit was extremely important, right? So to have that, like, yeah, you can sort of imagine an agent coming in and saying, okay, this is going to make life better for you if you let us have your children and then we're going to send them back ready to take on the white world. The Indians kind of got that, but in practice, it was much harder for them to deal with. The other thing is just that shift in culture, right? When you've got these, like, the kids, you'll see these like very dramatic photos of the young boys and girls as they come into the schools looking very much like they would have come off the planes. Then immediately, like within, the next picture over, their hair's cut, they're wearing like very white suits and ties. And a lot of them seem to have been like kids kind of grew up with that, and you see quite a bit of the Native Americans end up being perfectly fine with that, to the point today, like most of them are going to be dressed in Western attire. There's various different degrees. Like the sort of the one that I see a lot when I've kind of what I've previewed around of the tribes is they kind of like the cowboy look a little bit now, but still, I mean, it's pretty, like, it's a very Western attire. And at the time, that switch, the big switch for them though was the hair cutting. When they cut the hair, there's quite a few kids that were, because the hair in Native American culture is very important. That's why the men grew their hair long. And I remember there's this like kind of a heart-wrenching story of a young boy. Well, he's an old man, but he's telling the story, and he was talking about how when he first entered the boarding school, he was looking up a picture of Jesus, and one of the things that the natives admired about Jesus was that he had long hair. But he's looking up at this picture, and then he's got this Jesuit brother just cutting his hair, and then he says, like, the devastating part was to just let the hair drop to the floor. That really like affected him. So they placed a lot of significance around that. So that's kind of, the gist of what the challenges are now. And I'm kind of rushing through this, guys, but there's so much here. And really, again, I'm writing this book on this. And again, with the book, I will be able to lay it all out in full detail and you'll get the full story. But I'm just trying to give you guys some of what's happened. So you move through the generations. The boarding schools, the government basically abandons its mission with the boarding schools. The churches are basically left alone. By the 1930s, 1930s, there's something called the Marion Report, which was done by the Franklin Roosevelt government, which basically says that from the grant policy back towards the Indians, that whole thing has just been a big failure. They're not assimilating, right? Now, never mind the fact that some of the reasons that they haven't been assimilating is because there's been people that are undermining it the entire time. Leave that all aside. The Marion Report is actually super interesting. And there's a general trend and shift away from the old policy of dealing with this, like assimilating them, to basically just kind of like letting them be like sort of a self-sufficient, you're kind of on your own. There's still of course certain tribes where they rely quite a bit on governments subsidizing them, but the assimilation policies just really begin to dwindle after the 1940s. And then you get to this period in the 1960s, 1950s, especially into the 1960s, where you have the rise of what's called the Pan-Indian movement. And the Pan-Indian movement was this part of this wider, like, contextual thing that's happening with social revolutions all over the United States. But it's this kind of archaic idea that there's strength in unity, right? So some of these tribes where people are historically not friendly to one another, in the 1960s, there's this hope that they can make a pan-Indian movement, right? And there's a whole spectrum of, in terms of the complexity of interactions, a whole spectrum of who these people are. But one important factor in all of this, and I want you guys really to listen to this and really hear what I'm talking about here, because it's going to make sense to you when you're watching the news. And if you're in Canada, it's happened to you guys too, when you're watching the news, of what exactly is going on. Because concurrent to the rise of the Pan-Indian movement, there's also the social revolutions that are taking place within white culture in the West. And you get a whole plethora of just, and you guys know what I'm talking about, right? There was a self-loathing that took place prominently coming out of the left. These like liberal academics who start to, I guess, feel bad because they were the perpetrators of the stuff originally anyway. So maybe they're starting to feel like bad by the 1950s. And so they get this, like, there's this idealization of what the pre-Columbian, pre-Christian native cultures must have been like, and that we just ruined it. And this is not being necessarily perpetuated by by native culture, though they do definitely pick it up. it's initially picked up and pushed by white culture. And this actually has some long precedence, because if you go back even to the beginning of the end, as all of the tribes are being subdued, as they're being placed on reservations, you start to see these shows, these entertainment shows pop up that are traveling circus kind of things, like Wild Bill's Wild West show. And what he would do is he would pay these Indians to come travel with him, even though most of the time now they're wearing t-shirts, they're wearing jeans, they're wearing whatever the white folk are wearing. They would come to these Wild Bill shows, and they would don back into their traditional native gear. And it perpetuates this myth within white culture of the kind of noble savage of Rousseau that doesn't die out. As a matter of fact, in the 1940s, when Neyhart is interviewing Nicholas Blackout, Neyhart, a German who's really, if you know about like what's happening in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, the European market was like saturated with American Hollywood westerns. And these Europeaners, German, English, and this you hear about this all the way up until like the 70s and 80s. They loved American westerns, and they loved this idea of cowboy and Indian in the open country. So Neyhart is a German. He comes over in the 1940s. He wants to find the dying primitive Indian. So he goes to Black Elk, who at this point, Black Elk has been a Christian for many, many decades. And Black Elk tells him his whole life. Neyhart cuts off Black Elk's story in the famous book Black Elk Speaks right as Black Elk converts. So when you read, if you go back, we just recently did a book review on Black Elk Speaks. Popular level book, bestseller, of a man that's now actually a servant of God, recognized by the church. And you go back and you listen to this story, and Black Elk himself said, look, this guy cut off my story right when I actually think it actually takes on the most meaning and significance as I became a Christian. So this is a German, a white European, who's pressing this myth, because in Neyhart's mind, you cannot be both Lakota and be a Catholic, that they are diametrically opposed to one another. And I, Mr. White European liberal, am going to tell you, Native American, that you are actually being oppressed, and you don't realize it. And I'm coming to free you from your oppression, and you have to give up this Christianity. Whereas this generation of Indians, the ones that converted, they had no qualms whatsoever with embracing the truth of Christianity, while also making contradistinctions between the way that the U.S. government had treated them. But it was effective. It worked. It changed the minds of many white people in white culture. It changed the minds of many people in Native American culture. And out of this rose the Pan-Indian movement, and helping to buttress up the Pan-Indian movement, because it's not, and I repeat, it is not a majority. Maybe at certain points it's hit a majority, but the Pan-Indian movement is not necessarily a majority in the tribes that you would visit. Many of these people are comfortable with their religion. A lot of these tribes you go to are Catholic, which we'll get to with these boarding schools and what happened in Canada. And you always have to remember, right? Who's pushing the narrative? Who's funding these kinds of narratives? Who benefits from it? This isn't to say that the Native Americans are just being treated as puppets, but there is certainly an antagonist element within white progressive culture that is, as you all know, has extreme animosity to Christianity, and has extreme animosity not just to like the particulars of what happened within Europeaners coming over here into the Americas. It was very predominant within the Pan-American movement to kind of take on this particular narrative. The whole entire colonialist project is a mistake from the ground up. From the moment that this is why Columbus eventually becomes a target. The whole entire thing is a mistake. So even though there are particular tribes that they themselves would admit that they had benefited from interactions with the whites in terms of technology, in terms of religion, even if they're able to make discrepancies like, yeah, okay, sometimes you guys, especially your government, really treated us like dirt and really treated us awful we've held on to the Catholic faith, for example. But you have, as you know, the same progressives that are seeking to undermine the church for you, oh ye white Europeaners and you white Americans that are listening to me, are the same progressives that are trying to undermine it within these Native American communities. And you have to realize how tough it is to be a Catholic Native American, because you kind of get it from both sides, right? You have on one side, within your tribes, these traditionalists, the especially the remnants. The Pan-Indian movement has kind of died away, but there's still it instilled the sense of pride in their culture. Which, don't get me wrong, there are certainly things that the assimilation policies that the U.S. government was involved in that we shouldn't have been involved in, as a church, that we shouldn't have been involved in, that in acculturation process, another book I'm writing, that we should have adopted from other places. But we had to make a deal with the devil, the United States governments, the Jesuits did, in order to be able to work on these tribes in the first place. So that deal with the devil in the long term has kind of turned out to bite us. And the same thing with Canada. It appears like the Jesuits kind of made a deal with the devil, the Canadian government. But now, right, you have these progressives. They've come in. They seek to undermine and destroy Christianity wherever it is. Then you've got these people on the tribes who have been Christian and there's always been traditionalist elements on the tribes who thought that the acceptance of Christianity was a mistake, and that these Christians were there just to eradicate everything about the native culture. Which, if you actually read what the Jesuits are doing, there's moments, yeah, where there's a little bit of like European chauvinism taking place, but they kind of quit. But there's also a lot of mutual respect, right? For example, the Jesuits helped to compile the first Lakota dictionary, and the reason today that the Lakota is one of the most studied and well preserved of the Native American languages is because of the preservation project that the Jesuits undertook, involved in preserving the language. So no, they didn't just come in and willy-nilly want to eradicate the culture, even though there was certain things that they did which maybe now in hindsight have not worked out for the best for us. Okay, so fast forward. Now you've got this group of people that, regardless, their paradigm is that the colonialist project was awful and evil and bad to begin with. And so they're going to jump on a story like what happened in Canada, where a couple years ago there was, quote unquote, disturbances in the ground that they immediately reported as unmarked graves. And the problem with the unmarked graves, there's so many different things that you could go with this, right? But now that you guys kind of have a little bit of the background, there's a few problems with the unmarked graves. One, you could be looking at with an unmarked, like a quote unquote mass graves. I think in the Kamloops specifically, they saw 200 disturbances in the ground, potentially 200 graves. In the old world, before germ theory really took off, before antibiotics, mass graves were not unheard of. If you had a pandemic come and wipe people out, they were smart enough to know that, hey, maybe rotting corpses, are not a good thing to keep lying around for any significant amount of time. So in the preservation of public health, at times they would dump bodies into mass graves. It was not something that was necessarily, you wouldn't want to do it. Like, you can see that as well. Like, I've been reading the letters from these people. There's attestations from the fathers, from the brothers, from the sisters, the nuns that are working there, and you can see they're like, when a child dies, right? We have their letters and we have their journals and these things, and I'm reading through these things. You can see the way that like the death of these children touches them and affects them. Like the implication from the narrative of the mass graves is that this is part of some like wide project to like kill to murder young children en masse by the Catholic Church. And of course, the progressives are right there because their paradigm is the whole colonialist project is evil and must be eradicated, especially the Christian part of it. They're right there pumping this narrative. They're pumping the gas on that narrative where, if you were able to actually kind of step back from it. And this is where I think some of you guys out there that are critical of this, I don't, blame you for being critical of the narrative. But what I do say is, don't be so quick to dismiss the fact that it could be mass graves. It just doesn't equate mass grave automatically mass murder, right? It could be the, oh, I don't know, the 1917 influenza that came and wiped everybody out. There's well-known cases of tuberculosis that are killing these young kids. Kids are quite susceptible, especially in this stage before antibiotics really take off, to premature deaths. It's just the sad fact of the reality for these people. Now, one thing I want you to be sympathetic towards, though, is the Native Americans. Because what you have, and I was just watching, there was a really good, I'll link it in the description as a matter of fact. There was a really good interview, surprisingly from CBS of all people. And this guy, this interviewer, he's driving around with a guy that's in one of the First Nation tribes up in Canada. And after the Kamloops story broke, there was a succession of churches that have been burnt. This reporter's going around, and he meets with one of the tribal leaders in one of the First Nation tribes up there, and this guy's driving him around, and he takes him to this like pile of ash that was once a church. And this tribal guy is saying, look, well, the first thing the tribal guy says is, I actually believe we kind of have a feeling, we think we know who did it. We think it was one of the younger teens within the tribe. He said, I don't think somebody outside the tribe came in and burned this particular church. He said, but it's absolutely devastating for us. He said, look, it was a small little wooden church, and most of these are on the rural tribes. It's not these big grand churches that you see in the city. Most of them are burnt on the reservations, on the First Nation tribes. And they're these little tiny like wooden churches that serve a community of people that it wasn't easy for them to maintain these churches. So basically this leader is saying, look, yeah, I think it was a punk kid. He saw the news. He got caught up on like some kind of social media that kind of whipped him up into a frenzy. These progressives whipped him up into a frenzy, and he took it upon himself to go and burn our church. And the leader was like, look, if I could get my hands on him, like there was something would be done, but we can't quite pinpoint which one did it because these areas are so rural. But he said the thing is, well, I'll go. Then the reporter jumps over to Alberta, and there was one of these larger Catholic churches that was burned within a white community. And they do actually believe that it was like these stupid white liberal kids that live in these cities that burnt this church down. But immediately these people were able to like begin the process of rebuilding that church. But when you cut back to the people on the tribes, the man said, look, I don't think we'll ever be able to rebuild this church. This little church of ours, it's just gone now. Like it was all we could do to maintain it. So now these people have lost their church. And then they're also being told, that, hey, the church that you're a part of has like mass murdered children, mass murdered your own people. And then on the other side, they're being told by certain Catholics, and this is why some of you guys may wonder why I get so like upset by certain like traditionalist Catholics that come down so hard on our Indian brothers, is because these people have they have it tough as it is on a situation. We as Catholics shouldn't be adding to their misery. We shouldn't be making it harder for them to be Catholics. Many of the things that they do now, there was an attempt in the 1970s and 80s to sort of recapitulate some of the things that the original Jesuits were okay with in terms of like rituals and things that the Native Americans were doing, and allow those things to take place again so that we can have a more enculturated Native American church. So as we're trying to do that, you've got these traditionalists coming in and undermining that process, right? Who they only see the lens, the Catholic, through the lens of a very specific European custom. Right. So, yeah, no, you come down when you just be careful when you're coming after these people, be careful who you're coming after. You have to kind of make the certain distinctions, because especially with the Canadian, the U.S. government has been a little bit more like, they haven't made like these kind of, but the Canadian government is just groveling over itself, and actually, and the Canadian government was involved in pretty bad things, but they're like shooting themselves. They're shooting their feet, and they're shooting themselves in the hips and shoulders, like every which way, like self-inflicted wounds against themselves in like some kind of like, what's the word, like reparations for the atrocities that the Canadian government has committed. And in turn, they're also coming down kind of hard on the Catholic Church while not recognizing that it is the Native American communities themselves. Most of those tribes where those churches were burnt, think about where those churches were burnt. They were burnt on tribes. They were Native Americans' churches, parishes that were being burned, right? And you don't have Trudeau coming on the television saying, hey, you guys, when you're burning these churches, you're actually burning the thing that belongs to the natives. You're not, yeah, okay, you burnt this church in like white suburban Alberta, and that's going to be rebuilt. But you've also, like, most of the ones that have been torched on reservations, and they're these little tiny, like, little wooden parishes in the middle of nowhere that these people have had for like 100 years that they've held on to keep the faith alive. And where's the outcry? Right? Where's the Catholics that are outcrying over this? Where's the Taylor Marshalls and the Tim Gordons and the Eric Ibarras and all of these people that get so upset whenever Pope Francis does something? And these are the same people too. This is another thing that drives me crazy. These are the same people that tell us that we are not supposed to trust the U.S. government when the U.S. government tells you to do something because they're untrustworthy, except if you're a Native American. And if you're a Native American, then you just need to shut up about it. Right? Don't trust the Canadian government about anything unless you're a Native American, and then you just need to shut up and accept and whatever nonsense they're feeding you. All of a sudden, all of a sudden, when it comes to like the offenses that the Native Americans have taken towards what the U.S. and Canadian governments have done to them, then all of a sudden the trads want to take a step back and say, hey, come on, guys, like, it's not so bad. What you guys were kind of rough and tumble too. I mean, who cares if we kind of came in and made you all these promises that we broke one after the other? Who cares if we lined our pockets with the money that was spent? I didn't even get into the corruption around the agencies, right? So I can't say I can like walk away with like a moral of the story, because there's egg on a lot of people's faces, I think, around this particular one. Because the other thing, and this goes right back, like the Canadian government, in order to self-flagellate itself. That was a tautology. In order to continue its reparations without hindrance, they've decided they're going to do this thing called like denialism up there. For those of you guys that aren't familiar, there's a group of Canadians that are righteously upset about their churches being burned. They're righteously skeptical about what's in the ground at Kamloops, and they're saying that we should probably investigate that a little bit more. And I'm actually in agreement with that. But to like the Canadian government has come out and said, hey, to question it, what's in the ground in Kamloops, makes you a denialist. All right. And so now it's been totally politicized. And I think lost in the mid, if there is a moral of this, lost in the middle of all of this are the well-meaning Catholics, especially the like never considered well-meaning Native American Catholics who have lost their churches. They're now taking punches from their own side. They're taking punches by their own racial side. They're taking punches from other Catholics towards them. So if you're going to consider anybody, I really say consider them. So yeah, that's what I've got for you guys on this one. We're gonna kind of cut it short here in a little bit because I do want to jump over and see what Presidente Trump is going to offer us. Speaking of trusting your government, right? Nah, it's whatever to me. I have always watched I don't care what it is. I've always watched the inauguration. So I hope you guys can take something away from this. The book that I'm writing is not going to be all political. I have to cover some of the political stuff, and I thought this would be a good challenge for myself. Let me know in the comments how I did. I know some of you are, I know personally some of you are quite contentious over this issue. I know some Canadians, people that I would consider friends and allies, don't necessarily take the same position that I do on this, but I think there's a wider spectrum of what's happening that needs to be considered that's not necessarily being considered when we discuss these things, which is principally the X factor in all of this, which is the Native American Catholics themselves. They're often the overlooked demographic. So anyways, guys, if you're an American, go do your civic duty, watch a presidential inauguration address, and I will see you next time. God bless.